Om Tavakatamritam Tapta Jivanam Kavibididitam Kalmashapaham Shravanamangalam Shrimadatatam Bhuviganantiye Bhurida Janaha. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our class on the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. We've been discussing a long entry dated October 28th, 1882. And a brief heads up on our September classes. We've got not one but 3 September classes. September 9th, September 16th, and September 24th. Okay? So note the dates, 9th, 16th, and 24th. Let's see. Okay. So let's plunge in. I'm gonna attempt to finish this October 28th, 1882 entry today. Now, in the original Bengali, where we're starting today is the beginning of a new chapter. It's chapter 7. I mentioned a number of times that M in the original Bengali, he'll often use epigraphs for these chapters to kind of encapsulate what he takes to be the main import of that section. And he often takes quotations from the Bhagavad Gita. And this is no exception. So chapter 7, he uses as the epigraph verse 45 of chapter 11 of the Bhagavad Gita, which many of you probably know. Adrishtapurvam rishitosmi drishtva bhayena cha pravetitam mano me tadeva me dasya devirupam prasida devesha jagannivasa. I'll just give you Sri Aurobindo's translation of this, just so you get a sense. We need a little context. Chapter 11 of the Gita is Vishvarupa Darshana. That's what it's called. It's Krishna revealing to Arjuna his extraordinary cosmic form, how he exists in the form of the universe. Okay, and after showing this, Arjuna keeps prodding him, and then finally gives it to him, and it's so overwhelming and kind of scary, frankly, that this verse contains Arjuna's response to that vision. He says, "I have seen what never was seen before, and I rejoice, but my mind is troubled with fear. O Godhead, show me that other form of thine. Turn thy heart to grace. O thou Lord of the gods, O thou abode of this universe." Okay. Okay, that's fine. Okay, so one thing I find striking, so this is useful, looking at the epigraphs. Of course, the epigraph's not there in the English translation, but all these epigraphs inspire thought and reflection. And we can ask, why did M include this particular verse as the epigraph to this chapter? Okay, I don't want to give the answer, actually. So let me read the first paragraph and think about it, and then we'll revisit the epigraph. Remind me if I forget. Okay. So here's the first paragraph of chapter 7. Oh, again, since it's the start of a new chapter, M will give section headings. So this is the section heading, also missing from the translation. Brahmo Samajir Prarthana Paddhati O Ishwarer Aishwarya Varnana. It's the method of worship of the Brahmo Samaj. And describing the glories of God. Okay? And then there's a sub-subheading where M writes Purvakatha, which means Sri Ramakrishna is reminiscing about some past incident. Purvakatha. And then Dukkhineshware Radhakantir Ghore Goina Churi. He's describing an incident in the past involving Mothur Babu and the theft of certain ornaments from one of the deities in the Dukkhineshwar temple, and it took place 1869, way back, okay, years before. Okay, so this is all just giving a nice anticipation of what's to come. Let's look at the first paragraph. Sri Ramakrishna is speaking to Shivanath, who was a Brahmo leader. Shivanath Shastri, okay, and the other Brahmo devotees. Sri Ramakrishna, can you tell me why you dwell so much on the powers and glories of God? The term here for powers and glories of God is Aishvarya. Like Aishwarya Rai, the famous actress. That Aishwarya means glories, the glories of God. Okay, the splendor of God. Bengali, it's Oishudjo. Okay, so can you tell me why you dwell so much on the powers and glories of God? I asked the same thing of Keshabshen. One day, Keshab and his party came to the temple garden at Dakhineshwar. I told them I wanted to hear how they lectured. A meeting was arranged in the paved courtyard above the bathing ghat on the Ganges, where Keshab gave a talk. He spoke very well. I went into a trance. The term for, let's see if you can guess. Can you guess what Bengali term is being translated as trance here? Huh? Good guess. It could be, right? Because sometimes samadhi might be translated as trance. Any other guesses? I went into a trance. Bhava, bhav, that's the term. Bhav is one of these terms in Indian languages that has many different meanings in different contexts. And even in a spiritual context, it can have multiple meanings. So, for instance, just one example. Sri Ramakrishna is often referred to beautifully as Ananta Bhavmai, Ananta Bhavamai, which means he is a person or a saint of infinite spiritual attitudes. Something like spiritual attitude might be the best translation of bhava in that context. Here, though, I think Nikhilanandaji is right that it's referring to it's a mystical state. Now, does trance convey it properly? I don't know. I mean, I would err on the side of just leaving the original word because of its manifold connotations that are more or less untranslatable. So I would say something like, I went into a bhava, or into bhava. I went into bhava. And then leave it to the reader to figure out what that might mean. Okay, so I went into a trance. After the lecture, I said to Keshab, why do you so often say such things as, O God, what beautiful flowers thou hast made. O God, thou hast created the heavens, the stars, and the ocean, and so on. Those who love splendor themselves are fond of dwelling on God's splendor. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm going to turn down the temperature because it's a little stuffy in here. Okay. All right, there's a lot here. First of all, now let's think about the epigraph. I think we already have enough to think about why M might have chosen this particular epigraph. Any guesses? What does the epigraph signify? Arjuna being basically terrified by Krishna revealing his cosmic form to Arjuna. How is that relevant to this paragraph? Anyone? Is this too hard a question? Can mic runner? Adya. Thank you.
Is that more looking for another option, another version of it? Because the first epigraph represents Arjuna is looking for another version of God that's more palatable to him.
Yeah.
And
So what's the connection with this paragraph that I just read about Keshav's lecturing and focusing on the glories of God?
I can't directly connect, but just looks like they're looking for another version of God, which is more palatable, and not the one that he's being described as the all-powerful is not something that he can digest right now. So he's looking for that. That's
okay. I think you're on the right track. What's interesting is in most commentaries on this verse in chapter 11 of the Gita, what the commentators tend to say is, look, Arjuna was not that advanced a spiritual aspirant. He wasn't really ready for this kind of vision, cosmic vision, and that's why he asked Krishna to scale back the revelation. So it's kind of like, it might remind you of the first time that Sri Ramakrishna gave Naren that nirvikalpa samadhi. He touched him on the chest, and the whole world started disappearing, and he freaked out a little bit. He said, "What about my parents? What will happen to my parents?" And so on. And then Sri Ramakrishna says, okay, all in good time. And he brings him back to normal consciousness. So typically commentators interpret this verse in that way. Arjuna couldn't handle the sheer sublimity and immensity of the cosmic form of Krishna, and therefore he asked him to kind of scale it back and show me a more modest version of you or something. I think what M is doing here quite creatively is turning that around and saying Arjuna might actually be more like the Ramakrishnan, like following more the Ramakrishna's advice here, Sri Ramakrishna's advice, which is instead of being enamored with God in the world, Arjuna is just asking, I want to see the form of you, O Krishna, who is my best friend and my charioteer, something like that. Like a more intimate form of God that Arjuna loves rather than the cosmic form. So it's kind of like reversing the valence of the verse, possibly. That's one idea I had as I was reading it. So now, this paragraph, there's a lot to think about here. I think it's easy to misunderstand this. I think one could easily come away from this paragraph thinking Sri Ramakrishna is telling us, don't try to find divinity in the world, and don't focus on the world so much, because the world is not going to help you in realizing God. Something along those lines. I think that would be a serious mistake if you take it that way. I think that's something, he's saying something much more subtle, and we have to look at it in relation to other things he says elsewhere, and other things he does, and other incidents and experiences. So we have to take everything as a whole. Okay, so I think what he's criticizing the Brahmos for doing is something like this, saying, wow, those flowers are so beautiful. So just imagine how much more amazing and beautiful the creator of those flowers would be. So it's kind of making an inference to the greatness of God based on God's glories, the glories of God's creation. I see something, I think it's amazing, and then I say, well, the creator of that must be even more amazing. And Sri Ramakrishna is saying this is kind of superficial, first of all. Just kind of like if you meet somebody who's extremely wealthy and has a lot of possessions, and you're more enamored with that person's wealth and possessions than of the person. You don't even bother to get to know that person, him or herself, and you'd call that person rightly superficial, right? So I see it as a criticism along those lines. Sri Ramakrishna is saying, a much deeper and more intimate relationship of love with God just sets aside all that stuff. You don't even care to know. Like a kid who loves his mother is not going to ask, or know anything necessarily about what his mother does, how much she makes, what she's capable of doing, but just loves her as she is. Okay? So I think it's kind of like that the more intimate the relationship is with God, the less you care about the externals and the things that God has created. And at the same time, I think it would be a serious mistake to think that he's saying that we can't find God in nature. Because he repeatedly found God in nature, starting from a very young age. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with some of these incidents, but when he's young and he's walking in a paddy field, he looks up at the sky and he sees white cranes against the backdrop of dark clouds, and he goes into a state of samadhi. He loses external consciousness because he's reminded of the beauty of that contrast, the color contrast between the white cranes and the black clouds. That reminds him of or directly expresses to him divine beauty, the beauty of God, it seems to me. And there are many incidents like that. What's another? I mean, I bet you can come up with your own. But one day he's looking at a young white boy, British boy, leaning against a tree. And the moment he sees him, he goes into samadhi because he sees him as Krishna. That boy leaning against a tree reminds him of the pose of Krishna, and he goes into samadhi. And he'll often say things like, the infinitude of the ocean, he says. By looking at the vast ocean, we're reminded of the vastness and the infinitude and the sublimity of the divine, of God. So in all these ways, I think that Sri Ramakrishna would say that nature can be a great help in spiritual life. And it's a spiritual practice to perceive nature in a way that reminds us of God. That's really important to keep in mind. So he's not saying don't do any of that. I think that would be a serious mistake. He himself did it, and I think he encouraged it, and it's a great spiritual practice. That's why I have a Vedanta hiking group. Some of you are members of the group. So you can enjoy the beauties of nature. People like Wordsworth, William Wordsworth, there are other great nature poets. They're all about nature mysticism. But seeing the divine in nature, kind of the divine immanence within nature. You know, there's some people temperamentally who can't stomach this idea of God with form, different kinds of forms of God, whether it's in the form of a human being like an incarnation, a Christ or a Ramakrishna or something, or even like these, four-armed goddesses and whatever, Ganesha, the elephant. But they deeply resonate with nature. The moment they walk out in nature, they resonate with flowers, with the sky, with the ocean. And so there's the beauty of Hinduism is that it's so broad that you can literally see God and worship God in everything, without exception. I'm fond of repeating the story. I'm sure I've mentioned this before in this class, but I'll say it again because it's fun. One day, a guy comes up to Sri Ramakrishna and says, "How do I develop bhakti? I don't feel any bhakti in my heart. I don't have any longing for God, any love for God." And Sri Ramakrishna says, "What is the thing in the world you love most, more than anything else?" And his answer is, "I've got a pet goat, and I love that goat more than anything else, chagol." And then Sri Ramakrishna says, "Good. Now, look at that goat as God, and love and worship him and serve him accordingly." And then that person, after doing that, made tremendous spiritual progress. And I think the same can be said about anything in nature. Because remember, Sri Ramakrishna was an Advaitin in a different sense from Shankara. Everything is God, without exception, without subtracting anything. I just gave a talk on that, right? Which means what? That flower is God, literally God. The ocean is God. The mountain is God. So if you have that attitude and you look at things in that vein, then that can be a direct spiritual practice, just to be observing nature in that way. Okay. Oh, another example I thought of. When he was brought to the zoo, and the first animal he saw was a lion. And then what did the lion remind him of? The vehicle, of Durga, goddess Durga, and then Samadhi, and then he said, "I couldn't see the rest of the zoo." They just took him back. So again, you can multiply examples of these kinds of things. Okay. A couple more things here that I wanted to mention in this regard. There's another place in the gospel, several places, where he mentions that some Sikhs, some followers of Sikhism, who believe in the formless but personal God, like the Brahmo Samaj followers. They'll say things like, they told him, "God is so compassionate." And Sri Ramakrishna said, why are you talking about God's compassion? And they get confused. It's like, well, isn't God compassionate? He's perfectly good. He's far better than us. So what's wrong with saying that God is compassionate? There's nothing wrong with it. God is compassionate. But a child who loves his mother is not going to say, "Oh, how compassionate my mother is." It's taken for granted that the mother's going to love her child, right? And you don't have to praise the person for it because you expect it. That a child will automatically expect that from the parent. And that's not something that needs to be singled out for praise. When the relationship becomes extremely intimate, you no longer even think about praising your beloved in those terms. I think that's the idea. So it's a kind of, the more intimate the relationship, the less you think about those things. And then another teaching of Sri Ramakrishna that comes to mind is, he says this in many other places, he says, everybody is obsessed with looking at the garden and the things in the garden. Nobody bothers to ask who is the owner of the garden, who tends the garden. That's God, right? So in the same way, people are so awestruck and enamored with, intoxicated with the things of this world that they don't ask who's behind the world, who's the creator of the world. Okay, so now let's continue. This is actually just an example from earlier in his life, illustrating what he just said. So he says, I'll just repeat the last sentence. Those who love splendor themselves are fond of dwelling on God's splendor. Once a thief stole the jewels from the images in the temple of Radhakanta. Who is Radhakanta? Kanta means beloved. So beloved of Radha, Krishna. So this is remember in Dakshineshwar it's like a harmony of deities actually. We have Kali, Mother Kali in the middle. We've got 12 Shiva temples. And then we have Radhakanta also, Krishna. Okay. So once a thief stole the jewels from the images in the temple of Radhakanta. Mothur Babu entered the temple and said to the deity, he's now scolding the deity, "What a shame, O God, you couldn't save your own ornaments." "The idea," I said to Mothur, "does he who has Lakshmi for his handmaid and attendant ever lack any splendor? Those jewels may be precious to you, but to God they are no better than lumps of clay. Shame on you, you shouldn't have spoken so meanly. What riches can you give to God to magnify his glory?" Does this incident remind you of anything in the life of Swami Vivekananda? Yeah, exactly. Very good. Kshir Bhavani. So toward the end of his life, when he visits the Kshir Bhavani temple, as a temple of Divine Mother, he sees that it's in a very bad, dilapidated condition, and he thinks back to the history of Muslim rule and that the Muslims, actually, the conquerors, destroyed the temple and this and that. And he got really angry. And he kind of protested to Divine Mother and said, "If I were here at that time, I would have protected you, and why did you let this happen?" And then Divine Mother said, "Are you protecting me or am I protecting you?" It was a spiritual experience, and it was so powerful and overwhelming that he was deeply affected by it, and he became an extreme devotee of Mother until the end of his life, up through the end of his life after that. It was a really transformative kind of experience. So this reminds me of that. Those who love splendor themselves are fond of dwelling on God's splendor. I think we could link this to his teachings on the gunas, the 3 gunas. He'll say things like, if you go to a Rajasic person's house, you'll find, he gives these interesting details. He'll say, you'll find a picture of Queen Victoria on the wall. Remember, again, it's British colonial times, and so it's prestigious to align yourself with the British rulers. And Keshav Shen actually, this is one of his, maybe he was like poking Keshav actually, possibly. I don't know if Keshav was in his presence at the time. Keshav met Queen Victoria, and he also was basically, as far as we could tell from his lectures, he seemed to favor British colonial rule of India. He was in favor of the British occupation in India. And so maybe Sri Ramakrishna was indirectly poking him for that too. And then he would say, Sattvic people, by contrast, they don't focus so much on God's glories. They themselves are very modest in attire. There's no external show. Nobody can even tell that they're spiritual aspirants. They conduct their spiritual practices in private rather than in front of other people. So I think it's along those lines as well, that maybe more Rajasic people will be more interested in appreciating God's glories than trying to love God directly. Okay, so then he says, therefore I say, a man seeks the person in whom he finds joy. What need has he to ask where that person lives, the number of his houses, gardens, relatives, and servants, or the amount of his wealth? I forget everything when I see Narendra. Never, even unwittingly, have I asked him where he lived, what his father's profession was, or the number of his brothers. This is one of many places where Sri Ramakrishna is expressing his love for Naren. No doubt inspiring jealousy in the other people in the room. And a lot of people were wondering, why does he like this guy so much? They didn't really get it until later. And then he says, dive deep in the sweetness of God's bliss. What need have we of his infinite creation and unlimited glory? Dive deep in the sweetness of God's bliss. The Bengali term here is madhurya rosh, madhurya rasa. Dive deep into the madhurya rasa. The bliss, the love, the infinite love of God. And if we have that, then we don't need God's infinite creation and infinite glory. And then he immediately goes on to sing a song. In the translation, it says the master sang, but in fact, M adds something quite beautiful here. Abar shei gandharbo nindito kanthe shei modurima purno gan, which means he begins to sing with his, in a voice which is so saturated with love and feeling that it puts to shame the voices even of the celestial minstrels, the Gandharvas. So it's a very evocative and literary phrase which is dropped in the translation. And then we get this beautiful Bengali song. Okay, let me read the translation first and then. Dive deep, O mind, dive deep in the ocean of God's beauty. If you descend to the uttermost depths, there you will find the gem of love. Go seek, O mind, go seek Vrindavan in your heart, where with his loving devotees, Sri Krishna sports eternally. Light up, O mind, light up true wisdom's shining lamp, and let it burn with steady flame unceasingly within your heart. Who is it that steers your boat across the solid earth? It is your guru, says Kabir. Meditate on his holy feet. So it's a beautiful translation, and yet no translation can capture the beauty and the rhythm of the original. This is 12 lines, if anyone's following. 12 lines. Guess how many lines there are in the original Bengali? Half, 6. 6 lines. And the whole beauty in the rhythm of the song is that there's a triple repetition of monosyllables. Okay, let me give you, so, dub, 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 rup, shagore, amar, mon, dub, dub, dub. So, dub means dive. So dive deep, O mind, dive deep. But it's dive, 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 O mind, right? Dive deep in the ocean of God's beauty. And then there are 4 more of these kinds of triple repetitions. Kuj, 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 kuj le pabi, hridoy maje brindaban. Kuj, kuj, kuj means seek, seek, seek. Repeated 3 times. So here it's go seek, O mind, go seek Vrindavan in your heart. But it's this triple repetition of seek. And then in the 3rd stanza, light up, O mind, light up true wisdom's shining lamp. It's deep, deep, deep. Deep, we have a deep which we use for arati, that deep. Light up, light up, light up. Mentioned 3 times. And then dang, 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 dangai dinge, chalai abar shekon jon. Who is it that steers your boat across the solid earth? So it's like, this is like what's called onomatopoeia. People know what that means? You know what it means. It's a word that that sounds like what it means, right? And so moo or meow. Is that a good example? Yeah, it is, right? Okay. And so when you hear things, when you hear dang, 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 it's like you can almost like, it dramatizes the movement of the boat, the way that you feel like you're being carried across the river by boat. Or kuj, 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 and so it's it makes it very dramatic and kind of living. Okay, so dang, dang, dang is the boatman steering you across the earth or across the ocean of samsara. And then finally the last line, Kabir bole shun, 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 bhav guru Sri Charan. Shun, shun, shun. Listen, listen, listen. So that's the last one. Okay, so the whole rhythm of the song is it can't be conveyed really. Every translation the translator needs to take a choice. You pick a choice between strict fidelity, like to the literal meaning, at the expense of beauty, right? Or you go for beauty, but at the expense of strict accuracy and fidelity to literal meaning. And I think it's virtually impossible to capture both equally. It's usually a trade-off, okay? Especially when you're translating across languages that are so different from each other. If it's like English, French to English, easier because they're both very Latin languages. But when it comes from Bengali to English, oh my goodness, all bets are off. Yeah. So anyway, this is actually a very beautiful translation, but there's only so much you can do. And by the way, so dive deep, oh mind, dive deep in the ocean of God's beauty. Ocean of God's beauty here is Rupashagor, Rupasagara. Rupasagara. Rupa here is interesting because Rupa can have different meanings. Rupa could mean form, like a form of God. Here, but it can also mean beauty, and I think that Niklanji is right in rendering it more in terms of beauty rather than form. Okay. Now, let's continue. Sri Ramakrishna continued. It is also true that after the vision of God, the devotee desires to witness God's leela. After the destruction of Ravana at Rama's hands, Ravana is the demon, Nikasha, Ravana's mother, began to run away for fear of her life. Lakshmana said to Rama, "Revered brother, please explain this strange thing to me. This Nikasha is an old woman who has suffered a great deal from the loss of her many sons, and yet she is so afraid of losing her own life that she is taking to her heels." You might be wondering, what does he mean here? He means she's lost so many sons that what else does she have to live for? Why is she so concerned about continuing to live? That's the idea. So then, Rama bade her come near, gave her assurance of safety, and asked her why she was running away. Nikasha answered, "O Rama, I am able to witness all this leela of yours because I am still alive. I want to live longer so that I may see the many more things you will do on this earth." All laugh. So this is a nice little story. So Swami adds something. He says, look, even though it's easy as spiritual aspirants to get too caught up with the things of the world at the expense of God, he says, after God realization, so I think he might have in mind the Vijnani, for instance, somebody who after reaching the roof, which is the realization of the Nitya, the eternal, Brahman, looks back on the staircase that I had climbed, and this person, the Vijnani, now says, wait a minute, but the staircase is made of the same materials as the roof, brick, slime, and brick dust. And so the Vijnani can go back and forth and ascend and descend from the Leela to the Nitya and back from the Nitya to the Leela, because he sees God not just with his eyes closed, but also with his eyes open. So the Leela itself is a manifestation of God. I was also thinking of a few things here. For instance, Swami Chetanandaji, he talks about two different kinds of meditation. He talks about static meditation, which is typically the kind of meditation that our gurus in our tradition, the way that they teach us meditation, is we visualize the form of our Ishta Devata in our hearts, and we repeat the mantra, and we focus on that form, right? We concentrate on the form of God. That's static meditation. But Chaitanya also talks about dynamic meditation. And he himself does it, he says, frequently, where he visualizes, he imagines scenes from the life of Sri Ramakrishna, Holy Mother, Swamiji. And so it's obviously not static. I mean, because literally he's imagining Sri Ramakrishna, whatever the incident is, when he's going to school or when he's, interacting with devotees. So that's a dynamic form of meditation. It's what's called leela chintana, thinking of or reflecting on or relishing God's leela, the play of God in the world. And that's a very powerful spiritual practice, actually. One example of leela chintana is right in front of us. It's literally what we're doing now. Reading the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna is an example of a dynamic meditation. And it's a form of leela chintana because we're reading about the divine play of an avatara, of an incarnation, Sri Ramakrishna. And no detail is insignificant, no detail is irrelevant. Everything, if you love somebody, you care about everything related to that person, right? M, because he's meticulously recorded every little detail, who's there, it paints such a vivid picture, right? It's not just his teachings. That's the beauty of the book, is that you really feel like you're transported to that time. And you're sitting there with Sri Ramakrishna, hearing him talk to you. It's a really amazing thing. And so that reading this book itself is a very profound spiritual practice. It's what Muktidanandaji, the head of our Mysore center, calls Sri Ramakrishna Sannidhya Sadhana, practicing the presence of Sri Ramakrishna. Like actually practicing that he's really feeling that he's right there in front of you. And in reading the gospel is a really good way to do that. Okay, practice of the presence of Sri Ramakrishna. What does that remind us of? What's the famous book that I'm alluding to here? Yeah, right, exactly. Brother Lawrence's book, Practice of the Presence of God. It's a series of letters that he wrote. Okay. Now, let us continue. To Shivanath, he says, I like to see you. How can I live unless I see pure-souled devotees? His term for pure-souled devotees here is Shuddha Atma. Okay? I feel as if they had been my friends in a former incarnation. A Brahmo devotee. Sir, do you believe in the reincarnation of the soul? Master, yes, they say there is something like that. Actually, this they say is not quite what is said in the Bengali. হ্যাঁ আমি শুনেছি জন্মান্তর আছে আমি শুনেছি I have heard. Yes, I have heard that there's something like that. So here it's written, yes, they say there's something like that. But yes, I've heard there's something like that. And sorry, I forgot to mention just before that, this is the beginning of a new section heading. Of a new section, and the heading is Janmantur, which means rebirth. And then Bahuni me vyatitani janmani tavachajana. That's a famous statement from the Bhagavad Gita, where Sri Krishna tells Arjuna, I have had many births in the past, and you also have had many births in your past, but you don't know your births, whereas I know my past births. That's what Krishna is saying to Arjuna. Okay. So now, Sri Ramakrishna says, yes, I have heard that there is something like that. How can we understand the ways of God through our small intellects? Many people have spoken about reincarnation, therefore I cannot disbelieve it. As Bhishma lay dying on his bed of arrows, the Pandava brothers and Krishna stood around him. They saw tears flowing from the eyes of the great hero. Arjuna said to Krishna, Friend, how surprising it is. Even such a man as our grandsire Bhishma, truthful, self-restrained, supremely wise, and one of the 8 Vasus, weeps through Maya at the hour of death. Sri Krishna asked Bhishma about it. Bhishma replied, O Krishna, you know very well that this is not the cause of my grief. I am thinking that there is no end to the Pandavas' sufferings, though God himself is their charioteer. A thought like this makes me feel that I have understood nothing of the ways of God, and so I weep. Okay, so let's pause here. Okay, there's a lot here. This is interesting because a Brahmo follower Sri Ramakrishna makes a reference to past births, right? And then this Brahmo follower says, do you really believe in that doctrine, this doctrine of the reincarnation of the soul? And Sri Ramakrishna's answer, yes, I've heard that there's something like that. We might think when we read this, like, why is his response so weak? Or what seems to be kind of tepid, or is sort of like, yeah, some people say that it's true, and so I'm gullible, and so I accept it too. No, that's not what he's saying. I think there are a couple things going on here. First of all, if you read the entire gospel, over 1,000 pages, you're going to find countless references to rebirth, past life samskaras. In other places, he's very emphatic, and he'll say things like, there's a place where he says, one should accept Purva Janma Samskaras. One should believe that one has lived in the past and that we, in this lifetime, were born with samskaras, with latent mental tendencies and impressions from past births and so on. So he makes much stronger statements in many other places. So why is he so timid here, or seemingly timid? We'll also talk about whether it's actually timid or what he's... But partly I think it's because he's speaking to a Brahmo Samaj follower who's clearly skeptical of the doctrine. So it's kind of like, I think that it's all about the tone, because we're not there. We have to infer the tone. But I imagine the tone would be, do you really believe in that? Something kind of like that. So if the guy's asking like that, then the response is going to be, oh, okay, so this person is skeptical. And Sri Ramakrishna was very non-dogmatic. He was very liberal. And there's another place in the gospel when M asks him, will it harm me spiritually if I don't believe in Purva Janma Samskaras, in samskaras from past births? And he says, no, it won't harm you. But, and then he gives the same kind of teaching. Never for a moment think that you've understood everything and that what you think must be true and that everybody else is wrong. So that's kind of what he's saying here. So he's kind of encouraging this person because he could tell that the person is skeptical of rebirth. And he's basically saying, like, don't worry about it. It's not that big a deal. You don't need to believe it. But don't judge other people for believing it. Don't think they're dummies for believing it. Now, another side of this is, what do you think Sri Ramakrishna means when he says, many people have spoken about reincarnation, therefore I cannot disbelieve it? Somebody more critical will say, like, well, that's not a good reason to believe in a doctrine. Just because somebody says something, why should you accept it? Yeah, Adya.
I feel like his lukewarm response was not to encourage just blind belief in concepts, because the person who was asking him was not really a believer. He was skeptical about it. Mm-hmm. If Sri Ramakrishna had presented it like, yes, this is the truth and you just have to believe it, he hasn't technically experienced his past births. He would just have to go off of what Sri Ramakrishna is saying. Yeah. So I think he wanted to leave it open. So he is open to discovering and open to the possibility that, yes, there could be something like this, but not just take it on belief, on blind belief that, yes,
Are you talking about the Brahmo or are you talking about Sri Ramakrishna?
I'm talking about the Brahmo Samaj devotee.
Right.
Sri Ramakrishna didn't want him to just take it on blind belief.
Right, I got you. He didn't want to pressure him or make him feel pressured to accept it.
And also, I mean, like, because at a deeper level, it's probably not conducive to spiritual growth to just take on beliefs and concepts just like that without examining them, right? Mm-hmm. So he didn't just want to burden the Brahmo Samaj devotee with another concept, because he's not going to probably believe it anyway. So
right, and then it could be off-putting to a person. If the person is very skeptical of a doctrine and you try to foist it on them, that could have the opposite effect, actually. It's like a fundamentalist from a religion, and it's like, you start losing respect for that religion if that person comes on too strong, right? So yeah, that's possible. I think there's more to it, though. I think one can actually find some depth in what he's saying when he's saying many people have spoken about reincarnation. And this is a perfect segue to plug my book. Okay, so the book, which has just been published, is called Karma and Rebirth in Hinduism. And in chapter 3 of the book, chapter 3 is arguments in support of karma and rebirth. And I talk about 6 arguments. And 3 out of the 6 arguments are based on testimony from other people. And I think that there's a way to kind of unpack what Sri Ramakrishna is saying and bringing out the sophistication of what he might be suggesting. So let me just briefly summarize these 3 arguments for rebirth based on testimony. Okay, first one, the argument from verified reports of past life memories. Okay, hot topic these days because of the research of Jim Tucker, who's at the University of Virginia, and he's published whole books on this. The book that I'd recommend is called Before, Children's Memories of Past Lives. And I'll just read to you from page 31 of my book, one example of many. An American named James Leininger at age 2 had repeated nightmares of a plane crashing, shouting, "Airplane crash on fire," and told his parents that he was in his previous life a World War II fighter pilot whose name was James and whose plane was shot down by the Japanese, that his aircraft carrier was called Natoma, and that he had a friend named Jack Larson. His father, Bruce, later verified all of these claims, finding that they corresponded to James Houston, a fighter pilot killed in the Battle of Iwo Jima during World War II, whose plane took off from an aircraft carrier called the USS Natoma Bay. Natoma. His father also verified that Jack Larson was another pilot based at USS Natoma Bay. Tucker concludes, on the basis of the available evidence, that the most plausible explanation of the facts is that James Leininger is the reincarnation of the World War II fighter pilot James Houston. So that's a really interesting case. There's another famous researcher, the pioneer actually in this kind of research, was his name is Ian Stevenson, and he was a kind of mentor to Jim Tucker. And he has a whole book on cases of what he calls xenoglossy. Xenoglossy. Anyone know what xenoglossy means? It's a fancy term. You can show this off at the next cocktail party. Xenoglossy. It means the ability to speak a real language, often with great fluency and accuracy, which they had not learned at any point in their present lifetime, but which they claim to have spoken in their previous life. And I want to mention just one really interesting example of xenoglossy. An Indian woman named Uttara Haddar, Huddar, 1941 to 2018, she passed away just 7 years ago, who was born and raised in Maharashtra, and who spoke the local language Marathi. At the age of 32, a new personality took over, and she started to identify as Sharada, an early 19th century Bengali woman she claimed to have been in her previous birth. As Sharada, this is not Sharada Ma, but a different Sharada. As Sharada, she was not able to recognize Uttara's parents or friends. She recalled various details from her previous birth, including the names of numerous family members that were verified by Stevenson, and she did not seem to know or understand Marathi, Hindi, or English, which were languages known by Uttara. But she did speak and converse in typically early 19th century Bengali, a language never learned by Uttara in that lifetime, with native fluency and accuracy. On the basis of such evidence, Stevenson concluded that the most plausible explanation of the known facts is that Uttara, this Marathi woman, was Sharada, the Bengali woman, in a previous life. Yeah, can you pass the mic behind you?
I have fear of microphones. Anyways, but it could be a ghost. It could be something.
She could be possessed or something, right?
Yeah, it doesn't have to be reincarnation. I mean, there's alternate versions.
Yeah, alternate possibilities. But so is the suggestion that she might have been possessed by the spirit of that Bengali woman in the past? Is that the idea? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's also possible. I think it's partly the fact that she herself says that she was that woman in a previous birth, that he kind of, he acknowledges that what you just said is another possibility, but then he says that because she's also talking about having been that in a past birth, that gives more credibility to the idea that she actually was that Bengali woman in a past birth.
Yeah, because I had a similar thought, because xenoglossy is demonstrated by those who are supposedly possessed by spirits. Yeah. They speak like fluent Latin or some ancient language.
Yeah. And there are also, Stevenson, he was a real scientist and very rigorous, and so he distinguished different kinds of xenoglossy. And there's recitative xenoglossy, and there's responsive xenoglossy. Recitative is the kind of your thing, though, is like when somebody in what seems to be like a moment of possession, they'll suddenly start rattling off like Buddhist chanting, like Pali chanting or Sanskrit or something, Latin. But if you try to hold a conversation with that person in that language, they're not going to be able to understand anything. But responsive xenoglossy means that person will hold a fluent conversation with you in the language they never learned in this lifetime, and that's the case with Uttara Haddar. Is that she was having a fluent conversation in Bengali, even though she's actually a Marathi woman, even though she had never learned Bengali in that lifetime. So these are very interesting. I mean, and the point is, I wouldn't put too much weight on any one of these cases, but it's the cumulative force of many cases that lends a lot of weight to this kind of argument. And then there are two others. So remember, the whole point of this is, Sri Ramakrishna says, what did he say? Many people have spoken about rebirth, therefore I cannot disbelieve it. And I want to suggest that there are at least 3 sophisticated philosophical arguments for rebirth that you can develop on the basis of testimony, okay? One of them is people, like young kids, saying, hey, I was so-and-so in my past birth, and then somebody goes and verifies those details, like the father of James Leininger did, verifying that he was actually the World War II fighter pilot shot by the Japanese in the Battle of Iwo Jima. Okay. Now, there are two other kinds of arguments based on testimony for rebirth. Another one, this is from page 33 of my book, the argument from latent mental impressions, samskaras. Okay. Here's the idea. Swamiji talks about this, Swami Vivekananda in Raja Yoga. He says, he focuses on the sutra 3.18 from the Yoga Sutra, which is samskara sakshat karanat purvajati jnanam. This means by perceiving the samskaras, the latent mental impressions, comes the knowledge of past life. Okay, in our Yoga Sutra class, which I'll be teaching tomorrow, by the way, we'll get to this eventually, hopefully. So, you gain knowledge of your past life by concentrating on your samskaras. Everything we've done in our past lives is stored up in here, in the subtle body. And so by concentrating on those samskaras, we can gain knowledge of what we did in our past lives. Okay? And so Swamiji says, explaining the sutra, each experience that we have comes in the form of a wave in the chitta, in the mind. And this subsides and becomes finer and finer, but is never lost. It remains there in minute form. And if we can bring this wave up again, it becomes memory. So if the yogi can make a sanyama, that's the term, sanyama, it means a kind of concentration, on these past impressions in the mind, he will begin to remember all his past lives. So it's Yoga Sutras is giving us a technique, a meditative technique for gaining memories of our past lives. Now, should we all run out and try this? Probably not. I wouldn't recommend it. I think that there are good reasons why God has withheld from most of us knowledge of past lives. We've done enough stupid things in this life. We don't need to know what we did in our past lives. But for some people, it might be beneficial, especially people suffering from certain kinds of trauma. If they know what it was in their past birth that has led to the trauma in this life. Or phobias, like there are certain kinds of phobias that people suffer from, and sometimes it's debilitating. And then if they know what the reason is, maybe they drowned in their previous birth, and that's why they're afraid of water. Even if somebody splashes water on their face, they'll freak out, and So just knowledge itself is kind of liberating in a certain way. And so that's why it's become a whole industry now, past life regression, hypnosis. A lot of them are frauds, but some probably are not. And some people actually are able to do that. And I think the more ethical and conscientious ones, they can really help people, assuming that the person is the right kind of candidate for that kind of treatment. Okay. So this is another argument. Let me read out the relevant paragraph. The argument from latent mental impressions then runs as follows. Numerous yogis and spiritual adepts claim to have obtained knowledge of their own past lives by concentrating on the latent mental impressions stored in their unconscious. If we are able to learn and successfully practice this special technique of sanyama, then we too will be able to gain knowledge of our past lives. Okay. So this is a second argument based on testimony. And so when Sri Ramakrishna says, well, many people have talked about it, and so I feel inclined to accept it, I think he has in mind things like it could be either of these cases. Okay, it could be the case of somebody who literally says from a young age, I was so-and-so in my past birth. It could also be adepts, like spiritual adepts, yogis, meditators, who gained memories of the past lives through this special yogic technique. But there's another argument, a separate argument, which is related, but it's also distinct. It's the argument from mystical testimony. And you might wonder, how is that different from... But see, notice, this technique taught in the Yoga Sutra, I wouldn't necessarily call it mystical. There doesn't seem to be anything mystical necessarily about it. It's even naturalists who don't believe in God or anything transcendental, they'll still believe in samskaras. Not based on past lives necessarily, but genes, right? And that kind of idea. But mystical knowledge of past lives is a distinct source of knowledge. This is the idea that, like Sri Ramakrishna himself, when he met Sharat and Shushi, Sharadanandaji and Ramakrishna, what did he tell them? He said, I saw in a vision that you were disciples of Jesus Christ in a past birth. He had a mystical vision of other people's past lives. He had this in many occasions. So he even had a mystical vision of Mothur Babu after he left his body, his wealthy patron. He said, Mothur still has some desires left, and so he'll be reborn as a king, something along those lines. And so this is mystical. This is actually distinct. I hope you can see how this is distinct from concentrating on your samskaras. He's not concentrating on samskaras, on other people. He's not looking at the samskaras of Shashi and Sharat and deciding that they were disciples of Christ. He told M that he was part of Chaitanya's group. No, not based on samskaras. This is a mystical vision, right? So that's an independent source of testimony. And that's also relevant. Okay, so I'll just read from my book here. Many people throughout the world claim to have had mystical knowledge of their own past lives or the past lives of other people, as well as of various supersensuous realities, including God, an eternal immaterial soul, and non-physical realms like heaven. If such putative, this gets a little technical, if such putative mystical experiences have epistemic value, then they constitute strong evidence for mainstream Hindu doctrines of karma and rebirth. Okay, so this would be one way of unpacking what Sri Ramakrishna is saying here, is that there are at least 3 different arguments for rebirth based on testimony. And we can defend what Sri Ramakrishna is saying along those lines, but also keeping in mind the context and that he was speaking to a skeptic of rebirth. And when I give talks on Hinduism, I like to distinguish Hinduism from Hinduism plus. Some of you attended that talk, so you'll know what I mean. I'm not going to go into the details of the core Hinduism, which are these 4 core doctrines. You can look at my talk, A Tale of Two Hinduisms. But I conspicuously refrain from building karma and rebirth into the core doctrines of Hinduism. I include it in Hinduism plus, but not in the core Hinduism. And one of the reasons is because I think that you don't have to believe in karma and rebirth to be a Hindu. You can be a perfectly good Hindu without believing in karma and rebirth. And I mean, I think one of the nice things about Hinduism is that it's not so rigid in its orthodoxy and it's like in its doctrinal orthodoxy. You have to subscribe to doctrines X, Y, and Z to be a Hindu, to make the cut, you know, like the Nicene Creed and like in Christianity or whatever. So it's not like that. Some people, I think, claim or caricature Hinduism as claiming that you have to believe in these doctrines to, but no, that's not the case. And I think that's a virtue. And another thing that Hinduism understands really well, I think better than other religions, and some other religions, is that spiritual life is a journey. And that there are certain doctrines when you start on the spiritual path, which you have this knee-jerk aversion toward, you don't really want to stomach it, you can't stomach it, right? But, you know, it's Hinduism, it doesn't set the entry bar too high, you know? It says, that's okay. I'll take you where you are. But, as Sri Ramakrishna will say again and again, don't assume that what you think now is the absolute truth. Be open to evolving. And lo and behold, look at M. M is a good example of somebody who didn't believe in rebirth, didn't think much of Sri Ramakrishna to begin with, and then he was, converted into one of Sri Ramakrishna's greatest devotees, saw him as God himself, and fully believed in karma and rebirth. And because that was his spiritual journey, that was his spiritual growth, right? And so Sri Ramakrishna was very liberal about these things. And so I think it's precisely because he's so non-coercive in his response to this Brahmo follower that I think the Brahmo follower is probably, he probably found that appealing. And he's like, oh, okay, good. He's not trying to force that doctrine down my throat. Maybe there's something to it, right? Maybe he's not trying to sell me something. That's the way I see it. Okay, so there's a lot there. What I'll do is I'll just finish the entry. There isn't too much to discuss in the rest of it, but we'll just finish it. Okay. M says, it was about 8:30 when the evening worship began in the prayer hall. This is actually the beginning of a new section. And the section heading is Kirtananande, which means in the bliss of Kirtana, like singing and dancing about God. Bhakta Shunge, with his devotees. So M says, it was about 8:30 when the evening worship began in the prayer hall. Soon the moon rose in the autumn sky and flooded the trees and creepers of the garden with its light. After prayer, the devotees began to sing. Sri Ramakrishna was dancing, intoxicated with love of God. The Brahmo devotees danced around him to the accompaniment of drums and cymbals. I want to add here, the English translation says Sri Ramakrishna was dancing, intoxicated with love of God. There's one word missing, Bhagavan. Bhagavan Sri Ramakrishna was dancing, intoxicated with love of God. And I think that's significant. Why? Well, let's read on. He then says, all appeared to be in a very joyous mood. Again, I feel like this is a little bit too secular because there are a couple things here. Here's the English. All appeared to be in a very joyous mood. Actually, the Bengali is Shokole bhabe motto jeno Shri Bhagavaner Shakkhatkar labh koriyachen. Interesting. He's dropped the whole last phrase, first of all. But let me first focus on this. All appeared to be in a very joyous mood. The Bengali is bhabe motto. Matta means drunk. Usually by alcohol, but in this case, obviously, bhabe motto. Not alcohol, but bhava. That same word bhava that we talked about earlier. Bhabe motto. They're drunk with divine intoxication. Okay, drunk with the divine. And then he just stops the sentence there. But actually, there's a whole long phrase. Jeno, just as, or as if. Shri Bhagavaner Shakkhatkar labh koriyachen. As if they are looking at or witnessing God in front of them, in front of their very eyes. Sakshatkara means they're directly experiencing or seeing. Shri Bhagavan. Jeno Shri Bhagavaner Shakkhatkar labh koriyachen. So now, putting these things together, what's another omitted word? Bhagavan. So Nikhilanji drops Bhagavan from Sri Ramakrishna, and then he drops this phrase indicating that they're dancing around this person that they are looking upon as a kind of God. So it seems to me that if you are attentive to these kinds of details in the original Bengali, what you get is, I was just talking about the journey, M's spiritual journey. This text is also M's journey in recognizing the divinity of Sri Ramakrishna. And it's striking that it's like it might have been that this could be one of these incidents where it's like begins to dawn on him that Sri Ramakrishna is God himself and that he's literally witnessing God. You know, and so even though there are like little words here and there that you don't get, you might say, what's the big deal? Why are you harping on them? These subtle details, I think, matter. And let me now conclude. When the music had stopped, Sri Ramakrishna prostrated himself on the ground and making salutations to the Divine Mother again and again said, Bhagavata, Bhakta, Bhagavan. My salutations at the feet of the Gyanis. My salutations at the feet of the Bhaktas. I salute the Bhaktas who believe in God with form, and I salute the Bhaktas who believe in God without form. I salute the knowers of Brahman of olden times, and my salutations at the feet of the modern knowers of Brahman of the Brahma Samaj. Then the master and the devotees enjoyed a supper of delicious dishes, which Beni Madhav, their host, had provided. And I just wanted to mention a couple things here. First of all, he often mentions this mantra. It's a kind of mantra. Bhagavata, Bhakta, Bhagavan. Bhagavata means the great Vaishnava scripture, Bhagavata Purana. Bhakta means the devotee. Bhagavan, God. What do you think is the meaning of Bhagavata, Bhakta, Bhagavan? Anyone? Why this string of words? Yeah, they're one and the same. I think that's one. Yeah, exactly. First of all, there's a beautiful alliteration, A-L-L-I-T. It means that bha, right? So there's a power to the Bhagavata, Bhakta, Bhagavan, and that reinforces the meaning that they are one and the same, that all three, the scripture, the Holy Scripture, the devotee, and God are different manifestations of one and the same divine. Right? It's God himself or herself who is manifest in the form of the Holy Scripture, in the form of the Scripture, of the Gospel, for instance, in the form of devotees also. Yes. And now, this phraseology is interesting in the end. He salutes the knowers of Brahman of olden times. He says, this is Agekar Brahmogani de Chorone. Agekar Brahmogani. The Brahmagyanis of olden times. The knowers of Brahman of olden times. He's thinking of these Upanishadic rishis. Okay. Who believed in, if you look at other places in the gospel, I think it's pretty clear. What he says is they worshipped Nirakara Nirguna Brahman, which means the formless, impersonal Brahman. So it's like Shankara's Advaita Vedanta, that kind of thing. And then he says, I also salute the modern knowers of Brahman, of the Brahma Samaj, and he says, Idaning Brahmo Gyani de Charane Pranam. Idaning means this contemporary Brahmo Gyani. So the Brahma Gyanis of modern times. And now another question for you. How do these Brahma Gyanis of modern times differ from the Brahma Gyanis of olden times in terms of their beliefs? Yeah.
The Brahmo Samaj devotees are believers of God with Nirguna but Nirakara but Saguna.
Correct. Very good. Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Yes. Brahmo Samaj followers believe in God as Nirakara Saguna, formless but personal. Whereas the Brahma Gyanis of olden times, whom he also worships and salutes, they believe in Nirakara Nirguna, formless and impersonal and attributeless. Okay? Okay. So those are the things I wanted to cover. Any online questions? No? Okay. Okay, good. Okay, I'm going to get, that's an easy one. No problem. I don't mind those questions. Okay. How do you spell xenoglossy? Xenoglossy. Xenoglossy. Okay? Very good. Any questions? Huh?
Someone also, I figured it's you, but anyway, it says, name of the author of the book of Karma and Rebirth.
Yes. Karma and Rebirth in Hinduism. The author is Swami Medhananda. I'll just mention, it's an open access book, which means that the PDF is free. You can just download the PDF right now if you want. And we're going to be selling the book in our bookstore as soon as we get it, hopefully within a few weeks, and it costs $23. Should. And you can get it on Amazon if you want, wherever you're living, and through Cambridge University Press, who is the publisher. Any questions? Any questions about anything we discussed today before we wrap up the class? Are we good? Very good. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night, and see some of you tomorrow. I'm teaching Yoga Sutra tomorrow. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu. So